The villagers spoke of it for years, though none agreed on what they had seen. Some said the night was darker than any they could remember, the moon hiding its face in shame. Others swore the flames themselves had taken a strange hue, curling blue as though tasting something holy they had no right to consume. All agreed, however, that the girl's cries carried farther than the wind, and that the ashes drifted across the sky like a warning. It was the stepmother's doing. She had waited until the house was quiet, the father away, the servants sent to bed. Then she dragged the girl into the courtyard, her hands clenched around iron shears that glinted beneath the torchlight. The daughter's braids, long, thick, and shining like strands of night itself, fell heavy across her back, reaching her waist. They were no mere ornaments. The elders had whispered since her birth that her braids carried her ancestors' blessing, that strength and fortune twined themselves into each strand. The girl struggled, begged, but her voice was drowned by the stepmother's hiss. "You will not outshine my blood. You will not." The shears closed with a metallic snap. One braid, then another, then another. Each cut landed like a blade through flesh, tearing not just hair but pride, heritage, dignity. When the last thick braid fell, the stepmother seized them in her fist and cast them into the fire. The flames licked eagerly, devouring the offering. The smell rose sharp and bitter, and the smoke curled upward like writhing spirits. The girl collapsed to her knees, clutching her shorn head, feeling the cold night air against her bare scalp. Her sobs shuddered through the courtyard, but her stepmother only smiled, her face hard and cruel in the flickering light. The villagers who later passed by on their way home from the night market paused at the sight of the smoke. They saw the black ashes spiraling high above the roof, scattering into the wind. Some swore they heard voices in that smoke, ancient voices, murmuring like a funeral chant. A few crossed themselves and hurried on, not daring to linger. By dawn, only a pile of gray remained in the hearth. The stepmother scattered it into the soil, muttering that weeds were all that would ever grow from her stepdaughter now. But the wind had already carried the ashes farther than she could see, into the fields, the river, the very breath of the village. And somewhere, unseen, the ancestors stirred. The girl would never forget the sound of the shears, nor the crackle of her braids as they burned. That night, her life as she had known it ended, but another, one woven of ashes, memory, and unbroken spirit, had only just begun. The girl had been born into light. Even as a child, neighbors remembered her for the way she carried warmth into any room, as though the sun itself paused on her shoulders before moving on. Her laughter, quick and unrestrained, fluttered like bird-song, lifting spirits in a household that had grown weary of silence. Her mother, soft-spoken and gentle, used to braid her hair at dawn, fingers nimble and careful, weaving stories into every strand. "Our ancestors sit with you in these braids," she would whisper. "When you walk, they walk with you. When you fall, they rise again through you." But her mother's voice did not last. A fever swept through the house one winter, swift as a blade. The girl was left clutching her mother's hand long after it had gone cold, watching the strands of her mother's hair spill across the pillow like the ending of a tale too soon finished. She was only 12, too young to carry such grief, and yet grief took root in her, stubborn as weeds. Her father remarried before the next harvest. The new wife was regal, sharp-eyed, her steps measured like a queen's. She carried with her a daughter of her own, older by a year and full of restless envy. At first, the girl tried to welcome them both, offering laughter, shared stories, even the quiet comfort of listening. But her kindness only stoked their bitterness. The stepmother could not endure the way villagers praised the child, whispering of her beauty and grace. She had a beauty of her own, cold, sculpted, commanding, but where hers demanded reverence, the stepdaughters drew affection. Men bowed to the stepmother, but children ran to the daughter. Women admired the girl's humility, men admired her gentleness, and elders shook their heads in wonder, claiming they saw echoes of her mother's spirit alive within her eyes. Her stepsister, too, felt the sting of comparison. Where she was loud, the younger girl was composed. Where she was quick to boast, the younger girl's quiet strength turned heads without effort. Suitors whispered of the daughter's future, not hers. Every compliment to her rival was a cut across her pride. Still, the girl did not see the storm gathering. She poured herself into chores without complaint. She drew water from the well before sunrise, carried baskets of millet to the grinding stones, and sang softly while she worked, filling the air with sweetness. Even when her palms blistered or her shoulders ached, she lifted her chin and endured. The village children followed her like ducklings, tugging at her skirts for stories. She had a gift for weaving tales, and often at dusk she would sit with them under the baobab tree, recounting myths of trickster hares and wise spirits. Her laughter rang across the courtyard, and the children's giggles followed like bells. But within her own household, love had soured. The stepmother watched with tightening lips, the stepsister with narrowed eyes. Every kindness the villagers offered her seemed an insult to them. Every admiring glance felt like a theft. The girl remained oblivious, her heart open, her soul gentle, even as envy sharpened like a knife behind her back. There were moments, however, when she felt the edges of it. The way her stepmother's voice turned brittle at the sound of her laughter. The way her stepsister pushed her aside in small, cutting ways. Sometimes she would find her braid ribbon snipped in two, her water jug cracked, or her shoes hidden. She tried to ignore these cruelties, believing patience could turn stones into seeds, bitterness into peace. She was her mother's daughter, after all, raised to endure storms without cursing the sky. And yet, despite the cruelty at home, the world outside continued to admire her. Strangers would pause to compliment her composure, her unshorn braids gleaming in the sun, her eyes deep as river pools. Some whispered that she carried a blessing too rare to be contained. Others whispered darker things, that no one so beautiful, so pure could be entirely human. That perhaps her mother had left her with secrets the rest of them could never touch. The girl did not know these whispers. She only knew the weight of the stepmother's stare each time she passed through the courtyard. She only knew the stepsister's sharp laughter when she stumbled. She only knew that in the house where she should have been cherished, she felt more like a shadow pressed against the wall. But shadows do not remain shadows forever. In time they rise, stretched by the light, until they cannot be ignored. Envy does not arrive like a storm. It seeps in, steady as a trickle of water through stone, carving hollows no one notices until they gape wide. In that household, it began with glances, quick, sharp flickers of the stepmother's eyes as villagers praised the daughter's beauty, or as children tugged at her hands to follow her to the fields. The stepmother would tighten her jaw, offering a smile polished like metal, but inside her teeth ground against one another. Her own daughter noticed it too. Each time someone admired her stepsister's braids, her clear skin, or the brightness of her laughter, bitterness flared like a spark in dry grass. What had once been small jabs, mocking comments, hidden belongings, slowly grew into harsher cruelties. The stepsister would trip her in front of others, smear mud on her clean skirts, or scatter her work so she had to begin again. At night, she whispered into her mother's ear, feeding her jealousy, watering the roots of resentment. "Why do they love her?" the stepsister would hiss. "She is nothing but a servant girl in her own home. Yet they treat her like a queen." "Because fools mistake humility for worth," the stepmother replied. "But we will show them the truth." And so the plotting began, hidden beneath the folds of daily life. The girl, unaware, carried on as she always had. She rose before dawn, tied her braids with her mother's ribbon, and carried baskets of wood or grain with quiet strength. Her gentleness was not weakness, it was endurance, a steady flame that burned without faltering. She treated her stepsister with kindness still, sharing food when she could, covering for her when chores went undone. But kindness in the face of envy is often taken as insult. The more she gave, the more they despised her. The stepmother began to speak more openly against her in whispers carried through the village. "She has bewitched them," she would mutter to the women at the well. "Look at how people flock to her, it is not natural." Others listened, frowning, uncertain. They had seen nothing but goodness in the girl. But doubt, once planted, grows roots of its own. At home, the stepmother's cruelty sharpened. Meals grew smaller, tasks heavier. The girl's hands blistered, her feet cracked from long days of work. Still, she carried herself with dignity, her braids swaying as she walked, her gaze steady. That dignity was the very thing her stepmother could not endure. Every strand of hair, every shimmer in the sunlight, was like a reminder of her mother's legacy, one the stepmother could not erase. One evening, the stepsister returned from the marketplace, her face pale with fury. They called her the flower of the village, she spat, throwing her basket down. They said no beauty could compare to her. Do they not see me standing there? Am I invisible? The stepmother's lips curled. They will see only you when she is gone. The words hung in the air, thick as smoke. The stepsister's heart leapt with both fear and thrill. She had often wished her rival away, but to hear her mother speak it aloud was something else entirely. Gone. Erased. From then on, the cruelty took on an edge of intent. No longer was it simple mockery or small sabotage. It became something heavier, darker. The stepmother watched her stepdaughter with a predator's patience, waiting for the moment to strike. The villagers too began to shift. They noticed the stepmother's whispers, the stepsister's jealousy, but few dared speak. Some pitied the girl, but pity is a weak defense against malice. Others kept their distance, afraid of being caught in whatever storm was brewing. Only the elders, in hushed tones, wondered if the stepmother's envy might provoke the ancestors themselves. The girl, though weary, refused to let despair root in her heart. When she knelt at the river to wash her hair, she remembered her mother's words, "Our ancestors sit with you in these braids." She stroked each strand as though it were a lifeline. Whatever cruelty surrounded her, she clung to that blessing. But envy, once planted, is not so easily uprooted. It grew each day in the stepmother's chest, tangled with pride, watered by her daughter's bitterness. And like weeds, it soon threatened to choke everything else: compassion, reason, even fear of consequence. By the time the first whispers of fire and shears rose in her mind, the stepmother no longer recoiled. Instead, she welcomed them. The girl's braids, her pride, her inheritance, her blessing, yes, those would be the first to go. The night it happened was heavy with silence. Even the crickets seemed to hush, as though the air itself waited for something dreadful to unfold. The girl had finished her chores long after dusk, her arms sore from grinding grain, her feet raw from carrying baskets of wood. She slipped into her bed of woven mats, exhaustion pulling her down like an anchor. Her braids, long and thick, fanned out around her, dark ribbons glimmering faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the small window. In the corner of the house, the stepmother sat awake. Her eyes glimmered like cold steel, and in her hands rested a pair of shears. The blades gleamed whenever the firelight shifted, catching the red glow like the grin of a hungry spirit. Beside her, the stepsister hovered nervously, biting her nails, her excitement curdled with fear. "Must it be tonight?" she whispered. The stepmother's lips barely moved. "It has waited long enough. Her braids hold power. If they burn, her light will burn with them." The stepsister swallowed hard but said nothing more. She watched her mother rise, moving with the slow precision of a predator stalking prey. The shears glinted in her hand as she crossed the room. The girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, unaware of the shadow leaning over her. A hand clamped against her shoulder, pinning her down, and before she could cry out, the metallic snap of shears filled the air. Snip! A heavy braid slid across her cheek, falling onto the mat. Her eyes shot open. For a heartbeat she could not move, paralyzed by the shock of waking to find her stepmother looming above her, blade in hand. She opened her mouth to scream, but another hand pressed over her lips, stifling her cries. Snip! Another braid fell. Tears blurred her vision as she thrashed, trying to wrench free, but her stepmother's grip was iron. The stepsister hovered nearby, her face pale and twisted with something between triumph and horror. Snip! Snip! The sound of the shears grew louder in the girl's ears than her own heartbeat. Each cut tore not only through hair but through memory, the mornings when her mother's gentle fingers wove the strands, the whispers of ancestral blessings, the feeling of heritage braided into her very being. Now, piece by piece they were being severed, stripped away as though they meant nothing. Her sobs grew louder beneath the hand covering her mouth, and finally her stepmother released her with a shove. The girl collapsed onto the mat, clutching at her shorn head, trembling with rage and despair. Her braids lay scattered across the floor, dark serpents writhing in the firelight. Without hesitation, the stepmother gathered them into her arms and carried them outside. The girl stumbled after her, barefoot, her tears streaking down her cheeks. She reached the courtyard just as her stepmother cast the braids into the fire pit. The flames devoured them greedily. The smell of burning hair rose sharp and bitter, curling through the night air. Sparks spat into the darkness, and the fire twisted strangely, curling upward as if reaching for something unseen. The girl sank to her knees, her hands pressed against the earth, watching helplessly as the strands that had been her pride, her blessing, her inheritance, turned to smoke and ash. The villagers who passed on the road stopped at the sight. They whispered to one another, uncertain. Some crossed themselves, muttering that it was wrong to burn something bound with ancestral blessings. Others shook their heads, afraid to speak against the stepmother, whose posture was tall and commanding as she stood before the fire. The stepsister lingered behind her mother, her eyes darting nervously between the flames and the broken figure of her sibling. Her lips quivered, but she said nothing. The girl's sobs echoed into the night, carrying farther than she could imagine. Her fingers clawed at the dirt as though she could bury her pain, but the weight of the loss pressed down harder than any stone. For she knew, deep in her heart, that her braids were not mere ornaments. They were her link to her mother, to the women who had come before, to the ancestors who whispered strength into her spirit. To see them burning felt like seeing her own blood turned against her. The fire roared, the smoke thickening, curling higher. Some villagers swore they heard voices in the crackle of the flames, ancient murmurs carried on the smoke. The stepmother only smiled, her eyes lit with cruel triumph, convinced she had broken the girl's spirit. But as the final strands turned to ash, a wind rose suddenly, sweeping through the courtyard. The ashes lifted, swirling into the air, carried far into the night sky. The villagers gasped, crossing their chests, whispering of omens. The stepmother stiffened, her confidence faltering for the briefest moment, before she forced her smile back into place. The girl watched the ashes vanish into the stars, her tears drying into something sharper than grief. Something closer to fire. Her braids were gone, but their ashes were not lost. They were scattered, carried by the wind, planted into the soil of the earth itself. Something told her she had not been abandoned. Something told her the ancestors were not done. The courtyard was silent after the fire died down, but silence did not mean peace. The girl's breath came in shivers as she sat on the hard ground, clutching the edges of her torn mat around her shoulders, staring into the embers. The air smelled of burnt hair, bitter and lingering. Her stepmother had gone back inside, triumphant, the stepsister trailing behind like a shadow. Yet the girl remained outside, alone under the vast night sky. The ashes that had once been her braids smoldered faintly in the pit, glowing like dying stars. She lowered her hand into the dirt, letting the soil sift through her fingers. A strange warmth tingled there, a quiet hum that hadn't been there before. At first she thought it was grief twisting into madness, but then she noticed, the embers flickered in rhythm with her heartbeat. The girl rose shakily to her feet. Her bare soles pressed against the earth, and the warmth deepened, spreading up her legs like roots drinking water. She looked around, but the road was empty now, the villagers gone, only the crickets daring to make sound again. "Mother," she whispered, voice cracking. "Did you see what she did?" The wind stirred. It was faint at first, a breeze tugging at her ragged hair. Then stronger, circling her in a soft spiral, carrying a scent that did not belong to ash, wild jasmine, the very flower her mother used to tuck into her braids when she was little. Her knees gave way and she pressed her forehead to the soil. "I thought I lost you," she wept. The earth seemed to respond. Beneath her palms, the ground pulsed faintly, as though it carried a heartbeat of its own. The ashes in the pit swirled, lifting slightly before settling again. The girl gasped, wiping her face, her tears mingling with the dirt. That night she could not sleep. Instead, she sat outside, her arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the patch of soil where the ashes had fallen. A strange comfort grew inside her chest, not the comfort of being safe, but the comfort of knowing she was not entirely abandoned. At dawn, the courtyard bore new life. Thin shoots had broken through the soil where the ashes had been scattered. They were not ordinary plants. Their leaves were silver-edged, catching the light like blades, and their stalks glowed faintly in the morning sun. The girl gasped, kneeling beside them, touching the nearest sprout with trembling fingers. It was warm, almost alive. Her stepmother noticed too. She came out with her gourd of water, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the shoots. "What is this?" she snapped, striking one down with her heel. But even as she crushed it, two more appeared beside it, forcing their way through the earth. The girl's lips parted in awe. The stepmother paled, her jaw tightening. She turned sharply, dragging her stepsister inside. "We will not speak of this to anyone," she hissed. But by midday, whispers had already spread through the village. Children had crept into the courtyard to see the strange silver shoots. Old women murmured that they had never seen such plants before. Some claimed the girl's hair must have carried blessings stronger than anyone had guessed. The stepmother tried to shoo them away, to trample the shoots herself, but the more she destroyed, the faster they grew. Soon a cluster had risen, tall enough to cast shadows on the wall. Their leaves shimmered like glass in the sun, and in their swaying the girl swore she heard faint voices, a hum of many, like a chorus carried by the wind. That night the girl dreamed. She was standing in a wide field of grass, the silver plants stretching endlessly around her. From their leaves hung beads of light, glowing softly, and in the distance she saw figures approaching. Women, tall, graceful, with braids longer than rivers. Their eyes burned like stars, and their hands held bowls carved of stone. "Child," one said, her voice echoing inside the girl's chest. "You are not shorn. You are seated." Another reached out, brushing a hand over the girl's head. Where the braids had been cut, she felt warmth, and for a heartbeat, strands of light seemed to grow there, shimmering like threads of dawn. "They thought to take your strength," another voice whispered, "but they have fed it instead." What was burned has entered the soil. What was lost has taken root. The girl's eyes brimmed with tears. But I am broken. I am nothing without them. The tallest figure knelt, cupping the girl's face. You are not nothing. You are many. Your mother's voice, your grandmother's songs, the prayers of those who came before, they are here. She tapped the girl's chest. And they are here. She touched the soil beneath her feet. The dream dissolved into light, and the girl woke with her heart pounding. By the third morning the plants had blossomed. Their flowers were strange and beautiful, petals white as bone, streaked with deep crimson veins, their centers glowing faintly in the dawn. Villagers gathered again, murmuring, crossing themselves, afraid yet drawn to the sight. Some whispered that the ancestors had returned. Others said the girl's spirit had survived because it was never meant to be destroyed. The stepmother stayed inside, her eyes darting with fear, her lips tight as she watched from the shadows. The girl, meanwhile, sat quietly among the blossoms, her fingers brushing their petals. She no longer wept. Though her hair was gone, though her pride was wounded, she felt the hum of power coursing in her veins. The ancestors had not forsaken her. Her braids had been cut, but their ashes had seeded something greater, something that her stepmother had never meant to awaken. And deep in her chest, beneath the sorrow and the scars, a spark began to kindle. It was not revenge yet. But it was not forgiveness either. It was something older, stronger. Something waiting to rise. The blossoms opened fully by the sixth dawn. Their pale petals gleamed in the rising sun, silver at the edges, veined with crimson like blood sealed in glass. They swayed in a wind no one could feel, their movements deliberate, almost watchful. The girl knelt in the courtyard among them, her hands resting on her lap. Sleep had eluded her again, but she did not mind. She felt awake in a way she never had before. Every shift of the blossoms hummed through her bones. Every rustle of their leaves tugged at the edge of her thoughts. At first it was faint, like a song half heard across a river. Then it grew stronger, whispers threading together into words. Child of ashes, daughter of soil, we see you, we know you. Her lips parted, a shiver racing down her spine. Who speaks? The blossoms quivered, and though no one was around, the girl felt as though 1,000 unseen eyes had turned toward her. We are what was cut. We are what was burned. We are what remains. Her heart tightened. My braids. Not lost, the voices replied. Transformed. Your pain seeded us. Your strength watered us. Your bloodline breathes in us. The girl bowed her head, tears stinging her eyes. For years she had been told she was nothing, less than her stepsister, less than the woman her father had married in place of her mother. But here, in the whispers of the blossoms, she felt something vast and unbroken. You are my mother's spirit, she whispered. Aren't you? The blossoms swayed, releasing a soft shimmer of light, like dust caught in sunlight. Your mother. Her mother. The mothers before. We are all of them. We are you. The girl's breath caught. She reached out, touching the nearest petal. It pulsed beneath her finger, warm as skin. But then the voices shifted, no longer soft and comforting. They grew layered, heavy, pulling at her chest. Child of ashes. Daughter of soil. You carry us now. But carrying us is not simple. The girl frowned. What do you mean? The blossoms shivered. Their whispers cut deeper. We will test you. Suddenly the ground beneath her rippled. She gasped, clutching the soil as the courtyard seemed to dissolve. The blossoms rose taller, towering, their petals stretching like vast wings. The air turned thick, vibrating with unseen power. In a blink, she was no longer in the courtyard. She stood in a vast plain of earth, her bare feet sinking into soft soil. The sky burned with twilight hues, streaks of crimson and gold, and around her rose endless blossoms, thousands, millions, stretching into eternity. From their centers, shadowed figures emerged. Women with braided hair that trailed like rivers, their faces both familiar and strange. Ancestors. One stepped forward, her eyes sharp as obsidian. You are chosen, she said, her voice like stone striking stone. But choice comes with weight. Will you bear it? The girl's throat tightened. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Another figure appeared, older, her back bent but her gaze steady. Strength is not knowing. Strength is stepping when the ground burns. The blossoms swayed violently, the air trembling. Voices overlapped, louder and louder, like a storm of whispers. Walk, bleed, rise, break, build. The soil beneath her feet turned hot. She hissed in pain, but when she lifted her foot, a sprout emerged where her heel had pressed. Another step, another sprout. Her chest pounded. Why are you doing this to me? The voices softened again like a tide pulling back. Because fire tried to end you. Because cruelty tried to silence you. Because your blood remembers. Because you are not just a girl, they made you soil, they made you seed. The girl dropped to her knees, overwhelmed. But I'm afraid. The blossoms bent toward her, petals brushing her skin. Good. Fear feeds courage. Without fear there is no choice. Without choice, no strength. Slowly she stood again. Her body trembled, but she took another step. More sprouts burst beneath her feet, glowing faintly. Her ancestors watched, their faces unreadable but their presence solid, steady. By the time she had walked a circle, the plain was covered in new growth. The whispers hushed. The blossoms tilted their heads as though satisfied. The tallest ancestor stepped forward, her braids braided into a crown. She placed a hand on the girl's head. You have walked the soil. You have bled into it. You have risen. You are ready to return. Light swept across the plain, blinding her. The girl woke in the courtyard, sprawled among the silver-blossomed plants. Sweat clung to her skin, her breath shallow. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream. But then she looked down. Her bare feet were streaked with blood. Tiny cuts, like she had truly walked over sharp stones, yet none had been there before. And where her blood touched the soil, new sprouts had risen, small but glowing. Her hands shook. She pressed them to her chest. The blossoms whispered again, softer this time, like a lullaby. You are chosen. You are soil. You are seed. Remember. The girl closed her eyes. She was no longer only herself. She carried her mother. Her grandmothers. All who had come before. And for the first time she did not feel broken. She felt vast. The blossoms did not stop growing. Day after day they spread across the courtyard, curling over stone walls, creeping along the house's edges. Their petals gleamed in sunlight, silver and red, as though they carried fire in their veins. The girl tended them in silence. She watered them with bowls of well water, but sometimes she swore they did not need it. Sometimes they seemed to drink her very presence, bending toward her when she passed, humming faintly in her bones. At first the stepmother dismissed it. Weeds, she scoffed. Ugly things. Tear them out. But when the girl tried, her hands shook. The blossoms quivered, releasing a low whisper, and she stopped, unable to follow the order. Something inside her knew it would be wrong to destroy them. The stepmother's eyes narrowed. Soon others began to notice. Villagers passing by the gates glanced at the strange flowers. Some murmured blessings, bowing their heads. Others whispered in unease, claiming the blossoms glowed faintly at night. Rumors crept through the streets. The girl's braids turned into those flowers. They say the dead speak through them. Perhaps the ancestors favor her. The stepmother heard it all. And the more she heard, the more restless she became. One evening, as dusk draped the village in indigo, she stepped into the courtyard alone. She glared at the blossoms, their silver-red faces tilted upward as if watching her. You should not exist, she hissed. You are ash. You are nothing. The blossoms rustled. Not with wind, there was no wind. The stepmother froze. She glanced around, heart pounding. The house was silent, her husband asleep, her daughter in her chamber. Only the girl was outside, kneeling among the blossoms, quietly humming as she braided her loose hair into simple twists. But the blossoms spoke anyway. We see you. We know you. Your hands cut. Your fire burned. The stepmother's skin went cold. She stumbled back, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. Nonsense, she muttered. It's the wind. Just the wind. Yet when she turned, she caught the girl looking at her, dark eyes glinting in the half-light. For a heartbeat, the stepmother thought she saw the blossoms glow reflected in her stepdaughter's gaze. That night she dreamed of fire. Her hands were covered in soot, her hair burned away. The blossoms grew from her chest, sprouting from her mouth until she could no longer speak. She woke screaming. The days passed, but her unease grew heavier. She began snapping at her own daughter, at the servants, even at her husband. That girl plots against me, she hissed more than once. She summons spirits. Her husband frowned, tired of her sharp tongue. You burned her braids, wife. Perhaps it is you who summons spirits now. She slapped him for his words. But in her heart, she feared he was right. For at night, when all should be quiet, she sometimes heard it, soft ringing like braids brushing against one another, like laughter that wasn't laughter. The blossoms whispered when no one touched them. Sometimes she swore they whispered her name. One evening, unable to bear it, she crept into the courtyard with a knife. The girl was asleep inside. The moon was full, draping silver light across the flowers. They swayed as if expecting her. She crouched low, gripping the blade. If I cut you out, the whispers will end. The rumors will stop. She will be small again. She will be nothing. She slashed at the nearest stem. The blade snapped. The blossoms did not fall. Instead, they shivered, their petals trembling as if in laughter. A faint hum rose in the air, building, weaving into words. We know you. Your envy feeds us. Your cruelty waters us. The stepmother's breath hitched. She dropped the broken knife. And then, to her horror, the blossoms tilted, not toward her but toward the girl's chamber. Their petals pulsed with a soft glow, sending light spilling across the courtyard like ripples of fire. The girl appeared at the doorway, her hair loose, her eyes half-shadowed by sleep. But when she looked at her stepmother, she seemed older somehow, heavier with something the stepmother could not name. "What are you doing?" the girl asked quietly. The stepmother stammered. Nothing only." But the blossoms whispered over her words. She lies. She lies." The girl's gaze did not waver. She walked barefoot across the courtyard, and where her steps touched, tiny shoots burst from the soil. The stepmother stumbled back, terror clawing at her chest. "You are cursed," she spat. "You bring ghosts into this house." The girl stopped in front of her, the blossoms glowing brighter at her side. For a long, terrible moment, they stared at one another. Finally the girl spoke, her voice steady. "No. You are cursed by your own hands. The blossoms only remember." The stepmother's mouth opened, but no words came. Her throat felt tight, as though petals were growing there, choking her silence. She turned and fled into the house, her shawl trailing behind her. That night, she sat alone in her chamber, rocking back and forth, muttering to herself. She could not sleep. Every creak of wood sounded like whispers. Every brush of wind carried the hiss of voices. Her daughter came to her, worried, but the stepmother snapped. "Leave me." The girl's presence, the blossoms, the whispers, they were all closing in. And deep down, the stepmother realized the truth. The blossoms were not hers to command. The house was no longer hers to control. The girl she had tried to break was no longer breakable. And that terrified her more than death itself. The whispers had grown too loud to ignore. In the marketplace, people spoke in low voices of the blossoms blooming at the girl's home. They had seen them shining faintly in moonlight, heard them hum when no wind stirred. Some villagers bowed their heads when they passed the courtyard, murmuring blessings. Others shuddered, afraid of what it meant. But none could deny this: the girl had changed. She no longer moved like a frightened child. Her steps carried weight, her eyes carried a calm that unsettled those who once mocked her. Even her hair, though still short from being shorn, had begun to grow again, thicker, darker, threaded with strands of silver light when the sun touched it. The blossoms seemed to bloom in rhythm with her presence, as if they were her crown. The council called a gathering. It was rare for such meetings, but too many questions lingered. "What grows in that house?" one elder demanded. "What curse has the stepmother brought upon us?" whispered another. The stepmother sat stiff, her face pale. She had grown thinner, her eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. Each whisper stabbed at her like thorns. Then all at once, the crowd parted as the girl entered. She wore no jewels, no silks. Only a plain dress, and yet she looked radiant. In her hands, she carried a single stem from the blossoms of the courtyard. Its petals glowed faintly in the shade of the meeting hall, casting soft light across the wooden floor. Gasps echoed. She set the blossom gently before the elders. "This," she said, "is what was born of fire. From what was meant to destroy me." Her voice was not raised, yet every ear heard it. "My braids were cut. My heritage burned. I was left in ashes. But the ancestors did not forget me. They answered, 'These blossoms are not curses. They are memory. They are truth.'" Murmurs rippled. Some villagers bowed their heads. Others glanced at the stepmother. The stepmother leapt to her feet, voice shrill. "Lies. She is possessed. She twists you with her tricks." But even as she shouted, the blossom on the council's floor began to hum. Its petals quivered and a soft wind stirred, though the air outside was still. From the courtyard beyond, the other blossoms answered. Their whispers filled the hall like a low song, and many villagers dropped to their knees in awe. The girl did not move. She only looked at her stepmother. "You cut me. You burned me. But you cannot silence me. The blossoms remember." The stepmother's lips trembled. She tried to speak again, but her voice broke. The whispers of the blossoms drowned her, weaving her guilt into the very air. She clutched at her shawl, shivering as if cold though the day was hot. And the villagers saw. They saw her fear, her guilt, her unraveling. One elder spoke, voice steady. The ancestors have judged. The blossoms are not curses, they are blessings. And they have revealed the heart of the guilty. The stepmother collapsed to her knees, unable to meet anyone's gaze. From that day on, the girl's life was no longer hers alone. The villagers came to her for counsel, believing she carried the whispers of the ancestors. Children left flowers at her door, women touched her hands for strength, and men lowered their heads in respect. Her braids grew again, long and strong, but never as they once were. Now they shimmered faintly, as though the fire's memory still lived in them. She wore them not as vanity but as a crown of survival. The blossoms in the courtyard never stopped blooming. Through rain and drought, through storm and season they remained. Some swore they hummed louder on nights when the ancestors walked close. And when the girl passed through the village, the blossoms seemed to follow her in spirit. Her very steps felt rooted, her presence like soil and flame woven together. She was no longer just a daughter. No longer a victim. She had become something more, an heir not of her stepmother's cruelty, but of the earth's memory and the ancestors' justice. The stepmother lived still but hollowed. She avoided the courtyard, avoided the villagers' eyes. She heard the blossoms every night, whispering truths she could never silence. She aged quickly, her face marked with lines of fear. Some said that was punishment enough. Others said the true punishment was knowing she had failed, that the girl she tried to destroy now stood taller than any queen. And so the story ended not with fire but with blossoms. The final image, the girl walking through the village at dusk, her braids brushing her back like banners, her head held high. Behind her, the blossoms swayed in rhythm with her steps, glowing in the fading light. Not chains. Not ashes. But roots and flame reborn. The ancestors had made their choice, and their whispers would never be forgotten.